was a very, very windy but sunny day in the spring of May of 1986 when a yellow school bus carrying the San Jose, Illinois High School boys track team came to Hartsburg-Emden High School for a head-to-head track meet. Hartsburg-Emden, where Matthew Rogers was attending school, and San Jose were conference rivals in central Illinois. Incidentally, both of these schools are just a few miles from where I grew up. The San Jose track team wasn't very tall. Wasn't very strong. But they had, I don't know, maybe they weren't tall either. They weren't very strong, but they had one particular athlete, and his name was John Waller. John was something of a living legend in that time amongst boys in Illinois track. He was an incredibly gifted runner who had consistently placed in the top 5 in the mile run at the state level ever since he was in grade 7, and this year he was in grade 12. John had achieved kind of a superstar status. It's something that few high school athletes ever do. He had a recognizable name and face for that time and place. The kind of guy that everybody at a track meet would want to chat with just so they could say, I was talking to John Waller. Matthew from Hartsburg-Emden School also ran the mile, and he was also in grade 12. Matthew had run against John on a number of occasions, only to watch John pull away from the pack down the stretch and leave everybody else way behind. Matthew was a decent miler. He was the strongest person in that event at his school. But the fastest mile he'd ever run in his life was 5 minutes, and John Waller's time was at least 30 seconds better than that. Since they often ran at the same events, John and Matthew became well acquainted over the years. John would sometimes give Matthew little running tips, and he was always very encouraging. John was a genuinely nice guy, and wow, was he fast. The mile race consisted of 4 laps around the high school track. Matthew waited anxiously, and now the time arrived. He took his place at the starting line, as did John and 4 other runners from their 2 schools. The starter raised his arm, fired the starter's pistol, and off they went. But from the beginning, something was wrong. Matthew was in the lead. They rounded the first curve, and Matthew was wondering, where is John? He wondered, did he trip? Did I just have too much adrenaline and got started too quickly? But no, he says, this seems like my pace. Matthew led for the entire first lap. And as he came back across the starting line where they had started the race, he fully expected to see John kneeling down somewhere nursing an injury. But no, he was nowhere to be found. John had to be somewhere in the race. He finished the second lap, still in the lead. His times were consistent with how he always ran. But where was John Waller? In the history of the world, it was obvious and self-evident to nearly everyone that death would reign unchecked in human life forever. To all appearances, it seemed like God was on the losing end. He created human life in the Garden of Eden, a place of perfection and harmony. But Satan successfully tempted the first two humans to eat the forbidden fruit. Before this, death wasn't real. It was just a something that was completely unknown. But as a result of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, death became a reality for the human race. In our time, scientists and doctors and nutritionists and fitness clubs all make claims that they have discovered ways to make our lives last longer, how we can be healthier. But none of them can keep us from dying. Despite all our modern advancements, death still seems to be as much in control as it always was. After the tragedy of the Garden of Eden, could it be that God, the giver of life, was now subject to death too? Death, the enemy's greatest weapon? The Bible offers a glimmer of hope. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, God tells the serpent, "And I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." John Waller wasn't about to simply disappear from a race. A little more than halfway around the track on the third lap of the mile race, Matthew was still in the lead. But then he heard the inevitable sound of John Waller's feet. He knew what it meant, and John Waller pulled up to his side. And John said to Matthew as quietly as he could, "Did you hear those split times they just announced?" And Matthew thought to himself, "You're talking to me now in the middle of a race? You're supposed to be trying to beat the pants off of me." But John continued, "We're right on pace for a 5-minute mile. But we've got to pick it up a little bit. Here, let me block the wind for you." And here at the third curve of the track, where the wind hit them the hardest, John easily pulled out and right in front of Matthew to block the wind. They finished that third lap with John in the lead, and all the other members of the track team who had been watching from the sidelines. With a great deal of excitement, they looked at Matthew and they said, "Well, Rogers, good effort, good effort. But we knew it was only a matter of time." Shortly into the fourth lap, John had built up one of those leads over Matthew, and now, without the pressure of setting the pace and maintaining the lead, Matthew was just able to run his best. When Jesus Christ came onto the scene, God gave him power over the enemy. He gave him power over sin and death. It seemed like God had the upper hand after all. Jesus resisted all of Satan's temptations. He drove out the demons. He healed people. He even showed power over Satan's greatest weapon, death. He brought a widow back to life in Luke 7:11 through 17. And then he did the same thing for Jairus' daughter in Luke 8:49 through 56. And later, perhaps most dramatically, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, calling him out of the tomb, alive and breathing and trailing grave clothes and all, in John 11:38 through 44. Yes, God gave Jesus absolute power over life and death. Death was no match for Jesus. People who feared for centuries that death and its stone cold grip from which no one could escape was their future. And when Jesus very calmly asserted his authority over it, wow, maybe the seemingly irreversible event could be reversed. But then Good Friday came, and Jesus himself was put to death. The one who raised people to life on a cross. And it looked like death had the upper hand now. But the reason we're still here today is because death did not get the final word. God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. In the text we heard earlier, 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul defiantly shouts, "Where, death, is your victory?" And there is no answer. And then he asks again, "Where, death, is your sting?" And again, there is no reply. Why is there no reply? Because God raised Jesus Christ from death, proving once and for all that he is ultimately in control of everything that goes on, both in life and in death throughout his creation. Sin is the sting of death. It's the main reason why death is so painful and poisonous. Sin causes death because it also brings judgment. We've all sinned, so no wonder we all fear death. But Christ bore the whole of death's sting in order that you and I need to experience none of it. Paul implies that death left its stinger in Jesus, just like a bee leaves its stinger in its victim. A bumblebee without a stinger still looks fierce, but it can't really do anything to anyone. The same is true with death. It looks ferocious, but because Jesus defeated it, death has no sting. And God, in his love for us, promises to raise us too when we come into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 15:52 tells us it'll happen in a moment, in the blink of an eye, when the last trumpet is blown. For when the trumpet sounds, those who have died will be raised to live forever. Because of God, Jesus' promise for you and me is that we will be raised too. This sounds way too bizarre for some of us to accept. In our world today, it defies every so-called rule or truth that modern science and culture has to offer. It defies so-called common sense. But God has never played by our human rules, nor has he put much stock in our version of the truth. And he has never relied on human common sense. When Christ went to the cross, it looked as though the enemy could finally claim victory. But it was a victory only in appearance. For a moment, perhaps, it appears that God let the adversary step in front. But in doing so, he simply showed more of his authority and his grace and his salvation. It was now near the end of the fourth lap and the final lap of the race, and Matthew was approaching the home stretch. With only 100 yards left to go, John had begun to fall back. And now once again they were running side by side. Matthew had never been so close to John at the end of a race. Breath for breath, stride for stride, he was running as fast as he could, and it just seemed to flow effortlessly. Matthew wanted to win, but what chance did he really have? With one burst of that legendary power, Matthew knew that John could easily pull ahead of him. But he didn't. And 20 yards from the finish line, John spoke out of the corner of his mouth to Matthew, and he said, "Okay, take it." "What?" Matthew asked, breaking concentration for an instant. John repeated himself, "I said, take it." And with that, John slid back behind Matthew. Matthew crossed the finish line in first place, with John just a fraction of a second behind him. John had let Matthew win. John's teammates, who knew nothing about this except that their man was losing, were yelling and kicking dust at him, and the coach was furious. On the other hand, Matthew's teammates were screaming and going crazy with joy. Their shot putter, Jeff Schlater, he picked Matthew up in the air and put him on his shoulders and paraded him around while people applauded. Matthew, meanwhile, was utterly confused and embarrassed. When Schlater put Matthew down, Matthew told his coach, "It's not what you think. John Waller let me win." The coach slapped Matthew on the back and he said, "Yeah, sure he did. Way to go, boy." But no one understood. Every person there thought that Matthew had just run the race of his life and that John had an off day. The only people who knew any better were John and Matthew. There was something pretty humbling about being considered a champion when you know your competition has let you win on purpose. Jesus suffered what appeared to be a momentary defeat so that we, you and I, could claim victory. That's pretty humbling, isn't it? In fact, Paul says it like this in 1 Corinthians 15. But thanks be to God, He gives us the victory over sin and death through our Lord Jesus Christ. But thanks be to God. He gives us the victory. It's a gift. It's free. We have done nothing. We can do nothing to earn it. And we've certainly done nothing in our lives to earn it. And Jesus says, take it. And we have no reason to fear death because of Christ's victory over death. I wonder, how could this truth change our attitudes about life and death? Think of some faithful person you know, someone you love maybe, who has died, and hold them in your thoughts for a few moments and consider, how does this truth, and this is a truth with a capital T, how does this truth impact that person? Death has been defeated. It hasn't been destroyed yet. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:26, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death itself. And Jesus says in John 11, I am the resurrection and the light. Anyone who believes in me will live, even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Christ's victory over death. What will you and I do with that victory that Christ freely and graciously gives us? We could say, no, I don't take free gifts. If victory can be won, I'll do it. I'll do it my own way, without anyone's help. Or we could take it anyway and later be embarrassed that we didn't really earn it. Or we could take it and then simply forget that it was a gift and continue to live life in a totally selfish and self-absorbed way. Or we could take the victory and say, thanks be to God, and let it guide us as we live our lives in gratitude and service to Him. Matthew Rogers watched, still in amazement and confusion, as John Walter gave him a cheery wave and got on that yellow bus to go back to San Jose, Illinois. But he still didn't know why John Waller had done what he did. And you know what? He never would. But we are ever so much more fortunate than him. We do know why Christ gave us the victory. It's because God loves us so passionately, so desperately, so utterly and completely beyond the bounds of human reason or reality. And he also knows that we are hopelessly dead and non-existent without that free gift of victory. Please, we absolutely cannot get into our cars and go home today without realizing what Jesus Christ has done for us, for you and me. He defeated death on the cross. He rose graciously from the grave, and he is graciously offering us the victory. If we will graciously accept and claim his gift and give him the glory and the praise.